it's a bit after 7, so I think I'm going to officially kick this off, everyone. Sound good? Okay, so my name's Alexandra Vandekamp. I'm the executive director of Gemini Ink. We're San Antonio's Writing Arts Center, and believe it or not, we're celebrating our 30th year of existence on planet Earth. So we're kind of psyched about that. My moniker or name tonight seems to be Writing Workshops because I've signed in as our fellow collaborator, Blake Kimsey, who's the executive director of Writing Workshops Dallas and can't join us tonight. We also have here David Samuel Levinson, a co-founder of this series, who will be facilitating tonight's author talk and introducing the featured author, Leticia Urieta, woo woo, and our amazing guest moderator, Joe Reyes-Boitel. Just a few quick things. We have some wonderful sponsors that make this possible. This is a monthly free author series. We want to bring great Texas authors right into your homes for free and expand the idea of literary community. And we can't do that without Humanities Texas, without the UTSA Library to help promote the event, some great bookstores that sell the books of the featured authors, like in Terabane Books in Dallas, the Twig Bookshop in San Antonio. Also, Lone Star Literary, great online resource, often shares about this event along with a lot of other Texas literary events. And of course, Writing Workshops Dallas is our fellow collaborator. Gemini, just so you know, if you don't, I'm going to tell you anyways. Okay, our mission is to teach the craft of writing to people of all skill levels so they can bring their stories to life. And part of that mission is to bring San Antonians, South Texans, people really from all over the country in contact with wonderful authors who've brought their stories to life. And Leticia Urieta is a great example of that. We'll be talking about her book, Las Criaturas. It's a beautiful hybrid work, very interesting. And Joy Reyes-Boitel, we really love bringing in great guest moderators, is a gifted playwright and poet, and she'll be moderating a conversation for about 45 minutes. And then at the very end, we'll ask for audience questions, and we'll share them with the author. So please mute yourself if you haven't. I think we're thrilled you're joining us tonight. I'm going to give the virtual mic over to David Samuel Levinson, who will introduce Leticia and Joe, and we'll get the show on the road. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Lovely to be here. Thank you for hosting, Alexandra. And thank you for letting me jump off. I'm sorry, I have another sad conflict. I would much rather be here, but let's get the show on the road. Our guest writer for tonight is Leticia Urieta. She's a Tejana writer from Austin, Texas. She is a teaching artist in the greater Austin community and a freelance writer. She graduated from Agnes Scott College and holds an MFA in fiction writing from Texas State University. Her work appears or is forthcoming in Cleaver, Chicon Street Poets, Lumina, The Offing, Quelly Journal, Medium, Electric Lit, and others. Her chapbook, The Monster, was published by Libro Mobile Press, and her hybrid collection, Las Criaturas, is out now from Flower Sun Press. Now, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Joe Reyes-Boitel, who is a poet, essayist, and playwright. Joe is also a queer mixed Latinx parent working in community. Somehow born in Minnesota, their family calls Texas, Florida, Mexico, and Cuba home. Recent and forthcoming publications include Huizache, Oya Drum, Scalawag Journal, The Ice Colony, Windward Review, La Voz de Esperanza, Chalaca Review, Borderlands, The Americas Review, and Your Impossible Voice. Joe's chapbook, Mouth, Neon Hemlock 2021, addressed the struggle of working through others' views and dominant culture's impact on the body and the self toward liberation. Their first book, Michael plus Josephine, a novel in verse, Flower Song Press 2019, reimagined Saint Michael the Archangel as a queer woman who begins a love relationship with Josephine, a disaster relief worker. That sounds awesome, by the way. Okay, so let's begin. I'm going to mute myself and you guys.
I know we're going to start with Leticia reading, but I just want to say thank you to everybody. And thank you, Leticia, for calling me in. I think that other folks meet up for coffee, but you and I always end up meeting up for these really wonderful conversations. And you were able to even visit one of my classes last semester. So I'm just really thankful to get to be here with you and to always learn from you.
Gosh, the feeling is always mutual. This book would not, I always feel like I need to say this, but this book wouldn't be in the world without Jo and her wonderful support. So just always like to iterate that. Well, I guess I'm gonna read a couple of pieces. And as both Alexandra and David said, this book, Las Criaturas, is a pretty short work. It's a hybrid collection of poetry and prose that I think we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about in our conversation. But the way I always kind of describe it is that it explores traditional stories from a few different cultures that are kind of part of my life and cultural history, and also explores storytelling around transformation and kind of what happens to the body and what happens to people who are kind of pushed to their limitations, either due to displacement or violence, or gendered violence, even, or sexual assault. So those are some things that come up in the work. And I'm going to read a couple of pieces, some poems, and then a hybrid prose piece as well. So this one is called Cancer Meets Leo Rising. I stand in the rain and read Wolf his horoscope from the newspaper that is already a week late. He will not remember, but there's something useful about seeing your past with clarity, a reverse fortune teller. He howls at my feet in recognition of the brush unturned, the places he never looked for the pack of cubs he came from. Wolf pants, puts his head on my knee. The rain sings against our fur, wet skin waiting for the breaking storm. Wolf is a Leo, galloping here in bold anger and finding relief that for once he can roll onto his back and rest. He doesn't have to save someone.
Thank you.
He doesn't know I was waiting to see my horoscope come true, that I was told to seek my lover in the woods on a rainy morning. The air after rain is insects buzzing home. I crumple the wet horoscope, let Wolf shake off his body and trudge off to a woodland floor waiting for his feet. Thirsty earthworms wriggle over my toes, aphids come to nest in my hair. I lay in the wet grass, imagine the whispers passing through the roots beneath me. Okay. This poem I wrote several years ago when I was first kind of starting to work on this book, and it's called La Rosa. And it was first featured in the Ice Cream Social anthology that came out of Malvern Books. And I just want to shout out Malvern. Unfortunately, that is a bookstore, an independent bookstore in Austin that just recently closed after the death of their founder, Joe Brundage. And that was one of the first places where I ever read and did open mics in community with others. So I always want to shout out Malvern and the wonderful community there. So yeah, La Rosa. Don't make me your mother's cautionary tale, and I won't make you mine. When we find each other, accept all that I have to give and take. My thorns can plunge bone deep and twist your heart from your chest, but don't make that our story. I don't have to be the fruit from that elusive garden, the siren calling from the rocks. We can be us two together, no violence involved, as long as you accept my giving and my taking, natural as the waves washing away and returning what you thought was yours. I can be your dream mujer, but never the waiting one, the crying ghost dressed in white that haunts rivers and crossroads for what she has lost. I will not be tethered. I can settle like sediments on a rock for a time, watch the city from the bus window, let you steer us to the way. Always I will return to my original state of being, folded in on myself to prevent withering, drying out, bunched closed, waiting for the season to open. You will have to time the cycles and hope you get it right. Pull your bleeding hand from my stem and remember what your mother told you about love's furtive flame. I think I have time to read one more that is kind of a hybrid poetic piece. And this one is called Cautionary Tale, and was in response to kind of a strange prompt from a writing workshop that I took several years ago that I took in a direction that was a little bit different from what the prompt was asking me. So Cautionary Tale. There is a rattling in the great hollow of my belly from the creature I swallowed who keeps falling and falling inside me, screaming a name I don't know. The creature is running up my spine and flipping back over, filling my belly with burning. I know that they are choosing to scream and choosing to fall. This is the only story that they know. I swallow a match and hope that the swirling chasm of my belly does not extinguish the light as I sit in the cave to eat my dinner, and the creature inside me sits in the cave of me and reaches for the falling match, a torch in their world that wouldn't recognize the carvings on the walls of my belly from the other creatures that have fallen in and can't find their way out of the story in my belly. They make up stories just to calm themselves at night around their campfires with their children, to tell them the tale of being stuck in the belly of a whale of a story that cares so little for them as long as they keep feeding me. If this is the story they want to tell and it will nourish my bones and keep me dry, then I let them yell and flip inside me so long as they know that without my body forged word by word, they would be nothing. Who came first, the light or the dark? Did the dark creep in before the light decided it needed to shine? And would there be dark without a light or a light without a dark? This endless spinning made the universe explode and crash together to form a singular place where creatures in my belly could feel safe, that they are trapped in the spinning smoke of a story. I'll stop there.
I love it. I went through La Rosa earlier today, and then of course I was led to Cautionary Tale. So I'm glad that you got to read those. We were on the same wavelength, no, as is often the case with us. You talked about Cautionary Tale in particular, and about how it came from a prompt that you didn't follow correctly. I guess if that's
Yeah.
Which I think we should all do, right? We should listen to the prompt and just be like, no, I'm not doing that. I'm doing this. Thank you for the spark, right? But what you've done is like you've shifted, I guess, the expected narrator in that. And you do that in so much of your work. But it doesn't have, considering that you work within the monstrous, you work within this transformation of body, which can be really unsettling. You have an intimacy in so much of your work. Most of it is first person, or there's this direct address to a you, that even when you have the piece with the Cancer piece, Leo rising, the wolf, it's our fur. There isn't a separateness at all. What brings you to that? Or what, I mean, considering the really difficult subjects that you tackle, what brings you in wonderful intimacy?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think that I've always been into horror, and I've always liked the idea of relating more to monsters and relating more to kind of the weird creatures, or kind of the things that were outside of human understanding or control. And kind of thinking about like, how does one creature's survival negate another creature's survival, right? Especially if one is feeding on the other. and so that's always been kind of interesting to me, and that's why I think I gravitate towards those perspectives. And like for that particular piece that I just read, the prompt was talk about being trapped in the belly of a story, and instead of, I turned it and I talked about it from the point of view of the story, you know what I mean? So like that's kind of where a lot of my attention goes to. And I think though that to answer the other part of that question, one thing that I think about often is, as someone who deals with a lot of chronic illness and like the ways that the body can often fail or be attacked or what have you, or changed in some way, I think that there's like a way that we acquaint ourselves sometimes with the loss of control over ourselves and our bodies. And so that loss of control does feel very intimate to me, you know what I mean? And so that intimacy kind of lives side by side with that kind of natural fear of mortality, fear of attack, fear of what could happen. And so I think that that's something I'm always rubbing up against, you know, and noodling over. I don't know that it's always successful, but it is something that I probably will be writing about forever.
The monstrous though, right? There's that fear within us that something is, that we're not in control of our own bodies. That I appreciate with your work in particular. But you also have this sense of the outside force kind of exacted on the human body, which it becomes another kind of monster. And a lot of your work does that, especially shorter prose pieces, short stories that you have. You tackle, like you said, with you tackle large issues, but in this one, in this particular book, I'm really caught by how you address migration, immigrants, and those who are kind of crossing, those who are viewed as transgressors, and how you look at those who are enacting power over those who transgressed, you know, to really question who the monster is. There's a lucidity there, right? But there's a deftness that I think is really hard to capture. What is your process and how do you get into something like that? Because for most writers, we want to write about these kind of political things, but it can be difficult, right? To lose the art that we carry in trying to hit these really hard and difficult subjects.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that I've tried and failed many times to like do that in a way that was kind of like you're saying, artful and still like human, right? And I'm teaching a class right now, and I see some of the students who are taking the class with Gemini Ink in the diving into the weird workshop, and something we were actually talking. Yeah, they're awesome. Thank y'all for being here. But some of the things that we were even talking about last night, because we were in kind of week 5 of that workshop, was how approaching storytelling from a speculative lens, or bringing in kind of these other genre elements of speculative fiction and horror and science fiction and kind of all these different elements, can often be the layer that you need to make it so that it's not a story that is allegorical necessarily, but that is still telling something human, still kind of talking about something that feels very real. And sometimes I think it also is just, for me at least, is about narrowing the scope to what is that particular character struggling with, what is that particular character trying to do to survive or to be okay. And so like there's a story in the collection about what happens to a woman and how her body, you know, transforms literally into a scorpion after a sexual assault, right? And so like that kind of speculative horror, you know, body horror type lens was really helpful for me to be able to kind of explore how a body can become alien after violence, right? And become alien even to oneself after violence. And so I think like breaking out of like strict realism is often the way that I explore those things in a way that still feels really real and human to me.
I'm reminded too of you have a short piece called Sickbed.
Mm-hmm.
You have like the yellow wallpaper, kind of this sense of like anybody who's outside of dominant culture may not be understood or isn't believed, right? And so you have some of that element too. Again, you address these things in a way that makes me completely jealous, because I would scream a little instead and just say, I'm not being heard. And there's the poetic is gone, right? The beauty within that experience, I guess, that humanness.
Mm-hmm.
But again, because you make it so personal, it's approachable. It becomes this universal, that I becomes this universal I, which I totally am in love with how you do that. It's not a question at all. I just wanted to say that.
I appreciate
Forgive
that.
me.
Yeah.
I have a, but how do you develop a character? How do you develop the space? How do you develop setting when you're in this I, and within pieces that that are so like well structured, right? And that are that offer a whole lot of story without becoming a novel, without becoming something huge.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it does pull from personal experiences, because I don't necessarily consider like a lot of these pieces like straight autobiography, but a lot of them do come from my own fears. They come from my own like experiences navigating other people's fears. And so like the first story in the collection, The Monster, I really struggled with that one the most because it's from the point of view of a child, but and I still am teaching and working with youth all the time. But at the time that I wrote that, I was working as a bilingual teacher in elementary school and was working with a lot of families who were undocumented, and seeing the way that migrant families were being treated and incarcerated and criminalized, and frankly still are, through several different presidencies. So like that's a serious issue. And I think that started with a question, right? Which is, what happens to a child's understanding of themselves when they are criminalized and surveilled? How does that change how they feel about themselves? And so like some of these pieces, I think, do just start with a question like that, and then the story starts to kind of come and like build from there. And if I'm able to then like explore that question a little bit, I think that helps me get to like the emotional heart of the story. But it does definitely come with a lot of challenges, and sometimes it hurts. Like there were stories that I wrote that I cried during, and like even rereading in the revision process, because they were very painful, or they reminded me of a particular experience that was very close to something that was hurtful, or very saddening. And so I think I don't know that there's always a removal.
That particular piece though reminds me too of, and you did it really wonderfully there with setting there, almost like the absence of a setting. This kind of, that things that were so distant became monster, things that were distant were like American landscape, right? I'm talking about migrating children then who are in a foreign space, who that was supposed to offer promise, suddenly becomes this monstrous thing that that can really, that can swallow them, in a sense. You spoke a little about different genres, And I'm totally against the idea of genres. I know we can talk about it. I still, and we've
I
had
think
discussions.
you're against genre distinctions.
I am against genre
Yes.
differences. Yes, excuse me. And I love blending all of them, right? But your work, this book alone, like physically, it's a hybrid offering because you put prose, you have short stories, you have poetry within. I don't feel a disconnect at all within it. One flows to another. You can feel that there's a sense of the stories speaking to each other, that they create this kind of larger world that we've kind of a taste of, which is to say you have to write some more. But but I would love to hear what you think about that idea of genre and the imposition of genre and even just hybrid writing and how you approach a work.
Yeah, I mean, I think you and I have talked about this before too, that genres, I think, often are ways that the publishing industry uses, they're categories that the publishing industry uses to sell books, right? On the one hand, that's like one reason why genres exist. I think the other is to have a certain set of rules and expectations for what a book should look like. But oftentimes it does go back to that same issue of like, how is this going to be marketed? How is this going to be sold? Who is this for, right? And I get why those categories exist. And I think, I've learned a lot from poets. I've learned a lot from prose writers. But one thing that I struggled with and have struggled with for a lot of my writing career is, I started writing as a poet as a child and like also writing stories. And when I was in my MFA program, I struggled because I was in the fiction track and there just didn't seem to be a lot of like opportunity for cross-pollination between the genres. And I wanted to take poetry classes. I wanted to be more in that space with my other poet friends. And that really bothered me. And I do think that there's some of the pieces that I was writing that are in this book, I was writing almost out of spite during the time in which I was supposed to be working on like a thesis project, which was supposed to be like a longer collection or novel. And so I ended up doing my thesis in two parts, which was one of them was this book and the other was a novel or part of a novel that I was kind of writing, in this dual space. And so for me, I think that there's just times in which a poem and some of the poetic considerations for brevity and line breaks and rhythm and things like that are necessary for the kind of story I want to tell. And then some instances where I want a little bit more space in a short story or a prose piece or some kind of like blend between the two. And I want to be able to kind of do something with flash fiction, or I want to do kind of a longer short story. So I think that when we get really bogged down, and I talk about this with youth and with students that I work with, like when we get really bogged down with this idea of what it should be, we don't allow room for what it could be. And I think that can be really harmful, especially early in the writing process. And so, does that mean that you might limit your writing career because of what you're doing? Maybe, probably. But I just don't know that at 36 that I really care that much about, like, it's not that I don't care about my writing career. Of course I do, but like, I think my idea of what a successful career and like what I want my work to look like has changed a lot over the last like 10 years. What younger Leticia wanted and cared about and fretted over is just very different. But I feel like I went on a long tangent with that, but yeah, I mean, and that's why I entrusted Flower Song with this particular book, because I knew that it was a press that was going to treat it with tenderness and appreciate it for what it was rather than trying to make it something else, you know, that I think a different press would have tried to do potentially.
Yeah, appreciate that about that they in some sense there's not so much of that grooming, you know, that that they fall into the sense of what things should look like, that it can then become anything. I and I think we should do that as writers too. We should say there should be, you know, whatever needs to come out in the voice and the form that it needs to come out in. And your work does have that. I like though that your work also, and I don't know if you intended it, but at the end you have writers. You have suggested like things to keep the reading. So it's as though you've placed, maybe this is like part of what happens with a thesis too. It's as though you've said, here's this book and here's where it fits, like in this family of our literary community, right? And so, and here's who, you know, here are the other books and other creative like speaks with and speaks to. I really appreciate that because I wish that we did more of that in general. And I wish that we could say like, you know, here's who I'm saying is part of my literary family. And I hear more of that, but who would you count in terms of like your literary family?
Oh, I mean, I appreciate you saying that though, because yeah, it feels, maybe it's also the teacher in me that wanted to like, so kind of what Joe's talking about, there are, I don't know if y'all can see that very well, but in the back of the, okay, yeah. There you go, buy the book and then you can have access to this, but there are, there's a list of readings, like continued readings and some writing prompts at the end of the book. And so I think part of that is just like, that's the teacher in me. I really felt like I wanted other people to like be able to use this in some way. But I think the other part of it too is that it feels just disingenuous to me to talk about your work without like acknowledging the many other writers and creators who are filling your creative cup, you know what I mean? And who are kind of like part of that process. And so that's another reason why I really wanted, you know, to acknowledge those folks. But, you know, I think I would name you as one of those people. I would, you know, I would definitely name my good friend Tez Figueroa, who is a wonderful poet and writer. I would name Irene Laura Silva, who is also in Austin with me, who has been a wonderful support. Oh my gosh, Carolina Hinojosa, so many folks that have been really wonderful. And Cloud Cardona, Delfina Cardona, who is another local poet. So many people that I feel like have done for me what I hope I can do for other people, which is showing me what is possible in my work and helping me break out of some of those limiting thoughts. Because I think that's where a lot of it comes in. We limit ourselves. We tell ourselves we can't do a particular thing or we shouldn't do a particular thing. And so that's what I hope that some of my work can do for other people, just as those folks writing did for me, you know, and passing that feeling on to one another.
I love that you name me as part of your family, but I'm thinking bigger. Like
you're thinking bigger.
Like if we're your sisters, like in the writing, I would say like Carmen Maria Machado. I would say like Marge Piercy. You know what I mean? Yeah,
yes.
I say there's some big shoes just waiting for you, you know.
Gosh, I would, yeah, those are definitely, that was probably one of the best things that any professor did for me in a space in which I had a lot of issues with my MFA program, but I was gifted a copy of Best American like science fiction short stories or something like that. And I read a Carmen Maria Machado story and like,
yeah,
that just like blew my whole world open.
Yeah, she's done that for so many of us.
Yeah.
So I have a good friend, Barbara, and we get together. Now she's living farther away, but when we would get together every few months, we'd be like, we each other chisme. And I
Mm.
loved it. I loved sharing the chisme, but the chisme was always just about us. So we were sharing our own good things. So,
Okay.
so I'd love to hear the chisme about you. Like, what are you working on now? What's happening now? What's kind of influencing you? Or what have you
Uh,
had trouble kind of putting down that you're reading or listening to?
The other folks who are here have been taking my class know that I am deep in the horror arena right now. Like I've been writing a lot of horror short fiction. And I think actually, he logged off already, I believe, but Richard Santos, who is my colleague at Austin Batcave, and who has been editing a Latinx horror anthology for Arte Público, which is coming out later, and I believe in the spring. I have a story in that I'm really excited about. I've also been working on a YA historical fiction supernatural horror novel. I've been working on comic scripts, both for other people's projects and my own. I'm submitting a poetry chapbook, which is all about writing about the body, writing about disability, chronic illness, pregnancy loss, all kinds of things like that. So I'm a little bit all over the place. That's why I can't even stay in one genre in one book, much less in the rest of my writing world and life. So yeah, I'm all over the place, and I think that's what continues to like feed my creative heart, I guess. Yeah.
So what you're telling us is that you won't have one book come out. You'll have 5 books come out. Like
Yeah, it's gonna be just like a deluge of stuff all at one time, I'm sure. But yeah, which I see a lot of other writers doing. I mean, publishing is long. Publishing
It
takes
does.
a long time. So yeah,
Yeah.
but
How,
yeah, thank you.
yeah, I mean, I love it. I love to hear what you're up to. Tell me, so let's go into some of the like media stuff. What are you watching now, or what would you kind of
Oh
lead
my
us toward?
gosh.
Or
Oh,
what are you reading? Or I
what
mean,
am I
what
not?
can't we miss?
Yes, okay. So many recommendations. Just finished The Last of Us. So good. Would recommend. I also my younger sister, who's 16, is staying with us right now for over spring break. And we are the only people that she watches horror with, because her girlfriend doesn't like horror and my parents don't like horror. So we're catching up. So we have a whole list. And one of them is From, which is starring Harold Perrineau, I believe is his name. Wonderful actor. But that one is very creepy. Love that. I've been reading a lot of different horror and kind of speculative work, including several anthologies on body horror, because I'm going to be teaching a body horror class with Austin Batcave in October. So if you're interested in exploring that, I can provide more information. Yeah, there's so much. I think that horror films and horror novels are having a really interesting like moment right now, and I'm loving it. Anything from Tor, Nightfire, which is their like horror press, I would highly recommend. They're publishing a lot of really cool work.
I mean, it's for me, it's not a surprise that this would come up. I mean, given the times we're in now, that feel really kind of dangerous, that are really dangerous for some folks. It seems like horror would be a natural thing, right? Something you could control as a writer, something that you can watch and kind of slowly take in when the real world is very menacing as it is.
Yeah,
So it's intriguing.
absolutely.
Yeah, I just stopped to think about it, but can you talk to me a little bit about like your writing process overall? Because I know like I'm not sure. Well, I know we talked about the things that are kind of influencing you, the things that you like, but you returned to some of, or in the beginning, you talked about traditional stories, some things that are rooted in like your cultura. I know I read one piece and wrote it down, Hungry Earth, I think it was. It reminded me
Yeah.
so much of Guatlique, in that
Mm.
original story, right? The Aztec story of the Mother Earth and how she was made horrific, basically, because she wasn't, I guess, behaving in an expected way, right? That she had defiled the religious space, right, in her story. But the Hungry Earth just reminded me of that kind of this sensuality, this kind of approaching, again, like we talked about earlier, this way of approaching that you have that can feel really violent because of like peeling. I think one line is about peeling away the pain. And so there's this very visceral kind of description for us of being really loving. And I know I'm coming back to this sense of transformation and all of that, but I'd love to hear about some of the traditional kind of culture, or if you grab those, or if you kind of recall those starting to write. How does that work for you?
Yeah, I think, yeah, my process, I don't know, I think is so varied, but I think I get drawn in by a particular archetype sometimes. I get drawn in by a particular story if I think that a character's story is more complex than the way it's often been told. And that's why, like, I'm also drawn to historical fiction and kind of history and learning about that, which I started this YA novel in 2020, and I'm fingers crossed gonna finish a draft of this year. But that kind of started with like historical exploration of the spiritualist movement and what that looked like in the North, in the North in New York, and kind of how, and then I was like thinking about how that looked in Mexico and how that looked in South, in Texas, and found some archival research about spiritualist societies here in Austin, and it just kind of spiraled and spiraled and spiraled. And so I think like a lot of the work comes from, again, like asking those questions about stories that haven't been told, or stories that feel like they have an emotional stake that I want to explore. I don't know if that really answers your question, but yeah.
Well,
I
I
think
think,
that's, yeah, what I'm thinking of.
I mean, you're talking about a story that has to capture you, right? If it doesn't, it's not going to capture the audience at some point, when you put it out in the world.
Yeah.
At all about audience as you're writing?
Sometimes I think it depends. That's something that was challenging and has been challenging with this particular book, is that there are some pretty heavy things that I'm exploring in it, because it is about people trying to communicate with the dead, and so like exploring grief, and I think I struggled with sometimes with like, are teens going to be able to connect with this? Are teens going to be able to, like, is this too much? You know what I mean? And as I was reading other people's other YA novels and other even middle grade novels, and like kind of exploring that, like I just finished Lakin Smith, Isaiah Smith's Omega Morales middle grade novel. It's really, really good. But that's a middle grade novel for like middle school and like late elementary school students, and there's some really heavy stuff in there about loss and grief and anger and rage, and it's a really beautiful book, and I think that helped me to understand that, like, the audience that you may be writing for, and even the age group that you may be writing for, is more than equipped to talk about some of these things, because everyone, and I think the pandemic has also showed me that, I work with students all the time who are struggling with ongoing feelings of anxiety and grief that our culture just has not dealt with as a collective. And so that, I think, also convinced me that, there are audience members of all ages that can and are and need to have conversations around some of this stuff,
I'm glad you're doing it. I know that we tend to simplify, right? Or maybe for our own sake, right? as adults, we simplify what we think children are capable of accessing or understanding, when the truth is that they're dealing with it. You know, our childhoods weren't immune to those kind of issues. So
No,
those of our youth today aren't immune either, you know. Can
absolutely.
you speak a little bit more about that? I mean, about even just the work that you do. I know you're working with Poets&Writers too.
Yeah. Yeah, so part of my role in Austin is as the program director for Austin Batcave, which is a nonprofit that offers creative writing programs to youth and students in the greater Austin area. So I train our teaching artists, I plan our workshops and work with our partners. That's really gratifying. I'm working on our yearly anthology right now that we put out every year. And then I also am the co-director with my friend and colleague Tez Figueroa for Poets&Writers, which is another organization that offers creative writing programs specifically for teens. And I also do teaching artist work on the side. Like I lead workshops on my own, and yeah, I'm very busy. I'm trying to be less busy because it's like even this week I took off from work this week for spring break, and that's been helpful because I really needed to be able to work on some of my own work as well. So yeah, trying to fit in all the creative work while also dealing with navigating all my other obligations is challenging, but I love what I do. I love being able to work with students, and they're so creative and amazing.
Well, I love it. I think in a sense you're helping more because I know that I'm of an older age range and I always want to take workshops, but I'm so thankful that there are young people who are learning stuff that I'm having to learn now, that they're learning it
Yeah.
when they're very young, because it'll just make them stronger writers in the end, which makes them more critical thinkers, you know, for the future.
Yeah.
Can you, so we've talked about this kind of the sense of monstrous, we've talked about the sense of like transformation, sometimes to the point of like being an outlier, the doctor. But could you speak a little more about body horror? And I'm going to sign up as soon as we're done for that workshop that you're teaching in October. But about body horror, about disability, about otherness, and how you approach it within your work. Because I look around that too.
Yeah. And I was able, and Joe is actually in an anthology that's going to be coming out as well. Hopefully in the spring, we're like pushing for that to be done very soon. Because I was teaching a class called Reconnecting to the Body. And so this is kind of an offshoot of that. But yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of my work centers on that because it's just like an ever-present part of my reality, you know. And you and I have talked a lot about this, that when you have chronic illness and chronic pain, there's really no separation from those stories. And because it consumes a lot of my energy and time, I can't help but bring it into my work. And so I explore some of it. Like, I think a lot of it also focuses on how can we find empowerment through acknowledging our stories and acknowledging how chronic illness and pain and violence and other things that affect our bodies, trauma, all of these things can really affect the way that our bodies function and move through the world. And so I think that definitely is something that I am thinking about and bringing into my work very often. Oh yeah, I was actually just about to show that essay in the chat as well. So that essay was one that I wrote and published last year, and it is by far the most vulnerable piece I've ever written about myself and about my body and my life, because it touches on both living with chronic pain and illness, and also multiple miscarriages and subsequent surgeries that have, occurred because of that. So I think that one is through a horror lens, because I think the body can be horrifying, but horror can also be a very liberating genre. And so I think that's why I come back to it often. I think sometimes horror is telling some of the most truthful stories.
Yeah. I've been lucky to be able to sit with you and talk about it, and you're so much more eloquent than I am. Again, for being a poet, right, I struggle entirely with trying to be able to put it into something that's understandable, because I just feel so often that I'm not describing enough, right? That I'm not, or that I'm covering, or that I'm apologizing in a sense. And so work like yours really does help for those who are audience who are struggling to even try to find the language around some of the things that you talk about.
And even in that essay, the essay that you put in the chat, which I appreciate y'all sharing. My mom read it, and my mom and I are very close, and I often talk with her about what's going on with my body and all these different things. But in any situation where you're a caretaker for someone, or a partner, or a loved one who you have to witness their pain, there's always going to be a separation between that, right? And I think she told me that after she read that essay, it made her deeply sad, but it also made her feel closer to me than she's ever been, because there was something in that ability to articulate it in writing that she couldn't understand when we were just kind of talking one-on-one with one another. And so I think that's always something I'm trying to get closer to, is how can I tell the most truthful version of what's happening to me, whether it's in fiction, fictionalized, or in poetics, or whether it's in nonfiction, right?
Maybe there's hope for all of us too. I mean, because I think that even in having read Las Criaturas, right? That and in having been able to see just be one of the early readers for some of it, I see your work progressing so that you get closer and closer to something that I hope that then those who are hearing it can then gain a little more, right?
Mhm.
I think you spoke earlier about just writing and failing at some of the writing. And I think that that's important to remember, because we think as writers that everything we put down has to be perfect, and there's this perfection, which runs totally counter to this idea of monstrous that we've been talking about for the last hour, right? And that things don't have to be perfect. And there's a real loveliness in that reminder. But I love that you also remind us that some of the stuff we write is just not going to get anywhere, and that's okay. So what advice, we're going to close up our little charla, right? But we'll open it up to questions. But what advice would you give to writers overall who are trying to just move their work in a new way, or just energize their work?
Yeah. I mean, I think overall, definitely consume the media that you want to see in your own writing. So, and I don't, I think it's this cliche that you have to read to be a writer. And of course, I think that's true, but I'm also watching a lot of TV. I'm also playing video games sometimes. I'm reading comics and graphic novels. I think sometimes we need to break out of oh, we should be reading serious novels in order to be the best writer we can be. That's just not, that hasn't been my reality. And I'm influenced a lot by television and film and other types of stories and music. So I think that consume the media that you want to see or inhabit the feeling of, that you connect with in your work. And then I think also, finding the community, even if it's just a few writers who, will motivate you and who can be your best readers. I think that's very, very important. Who do you get excited to share your work with? then that's the person you want to have in your corner. You know what I mean? Who can give you that honest, open feedback. And then I think too, going back to that truthfulness or that honesty, thinking about, and I think, or I guess rethinking what success looks like for you, and making that specific, and what feelings do you want to come out of that can sometimes, I think, like I guess for instance, I was talking with a group of teens about what they thought a successful writing career would be, and they were talking about like getting a 6-figure book deal, or like being the next J.K. Rowling, or things like that. And I was like, that's fine if that's what you really want, but like, what is that really getting you? Why is that something you want? Is it something you want because you were told that that's what success is? Or is that really like meaningful to you? And for me, what's meaningful is like young people coming up to me and telling me that they read my book and that they, you know, felt seen, or that they felt like they connected to something. Like that's meaningful to me. And I know that sounds kind of cliche, but to me, I think that that's what I've had to move away from, is some of the expectations of success.
Yeah,
and
we
really
do
be
have these
honest with
ideas.
myself.
No, we
Yeah.
have these ideas. We see big, we only hear about the big figures, right? We only hear
Yeah.
about the advances. We only see, given we're in Texas, right? We're not one of the coasts.
Right.
We're not, I guess we're not the popular coast, but when we hear about writers who are very far away, who are successful, we don't hear the work that it's taken, the years that it's taken to get to where they are. I know that I love, again, when you taught, when you spoke to my class last semester, I was able to buy a couple of copies of your book and just give them out, because it was just like, and it meant so much to be able to buy books like yours from people who were here, or who knew the area, you know, in a different way, and to give them to students who wouldn't buy them otherwise, or who didn't even know that they existed, you know, to
Yeah.
have them available. And I think that that's something that we should all try to do, you know, to promote writers who are right here with us,
Absolutely.
who understand the experience we're going through, or for whom we can actually learn, like, here's what it is to be a writer, and that it is dedication and writing, and it's consistency, and it's carving a path in community, which you have done. You know, you've given a lot toward that community. I really thank you for that.
I think you've influenced that as well. So.
So we'll have questions. I think Daniel or Alexandra. I know that this chat has been like going a mile a minute, but I'm not been able to see all the questions.
I can go through, so great conversation, Leticia and Joe. I'm still thinking through. I'm gonna be really nerdy and ask my own question first real quick. And then I obviously want to have everyone who wants to ask. Well, you know what? No, I'm not. I'm gonna shelve that for a second. Felicia, I think you said you wanted to ask a question. Are you still with us? I can unmute you.
I think that they left, but I
Okay.
got their email.
Okay, great.
So I will email them an answer
Okay,
to that
great.
question. Yeah.
And then Bethany, who did have to leave early, she did have a great question that I'd love to ask. She goes, do you have techniques for breaking out of strict realism in order to write? Great question, Bethany. I'm going to shout that out to the cosmos.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I mean, I've always been a fantasy and sci-fi reader ever since I was young, and I actually didn't learn to read till I was in 2nd grade. I really struggled with reading, and like had a lot of issues with literacy, and then it kind of clicked, and then I was reading voraciously from there. But I started by, like, my teacher would give us these story starters, and so sometimes like that would help me get past some of my like feelings of limitation. So I was able to read my own work. I just wasn't able to read other people's work. That's weird, right? But, you know, we were even doing an activity last night in the diving into the weird class where I gave the students an art piece that was like a surrealist art piece, and they had to do an ekphrastic story response to that. And so sometimes I think that can be helpful, where you could look up like speculative writing prompts, or you can look up some of these like art pieces, or even, you know, if you're able to go to a museum and see some of the weirder art pieces. And like, I think that can be a jumping off point. I think another thing that we've talked about in the class is just allowing yourself to dig into some of the what ifs of a story, or what ifs of a situation. So like, you know, maybe you're telling, I'm trying to think of like an example of a straight realist story, because I just don't write them very often, but like, well, okay, so friends, I'll give you for instance of a story that started with realism and then went in a horror direction. So I have a trail in my neighborhood that my husband and my friend and I run and walk a lot. And one time I was walking it kind of at dusk, and I was just thinking, like, the sun was setting, it was so beautiful, but there's woods kind of all around that trail. And I had my phone with me and everything, and my keys, and I have a thing on my key that's like, if someone were to try to attack me, I would smack them with it or something like that, right? And I was thinking about how, as a woman, I have to often be cognizant of my surroundings, even in that like really beautiful, peaceful space. And a man was like walking behind me, and I didn't hear him. And there was nothing threatening about him, but it just like startled me. And that kind of just got me thinking about this very realistic situation, and like the want to be able to be exercising and moving my body in a public space. And then it started to go into like a horror kind of ghost story direction, where I was thinking about like this woman who sees this woman running every day, but oh my God, she's a ghost. She's stuck in like some kind of time loop or something like that, right? So I think sometimes it is just asking yourself some of those like what if questions, that explores the very real reality of like stalking, violence, you know, like domestic violence, which is what comes up in that story. So that was a really convoluted like answer to that question, but I think that that's one of the ways in which I go about doing that.
Well, I think that's a great question. Yeah, because I think the surreal is always right there alongside the real, or meshing in and out of it. So I think, yeah, you just never know when something that's seemingly feeling safe or normal quickly changes. So I loved your response, actually. And I love that idea of ekphrastic, like being inspired by another piece of artwork to get to a new place you might not have been able to do on your own. So yeah, no, great ideas. You have a few other questions for Leticia, so I'm gonna like happily share them.
Okay.
Ron Jacinto has said, I noticed on your website that you got an MFA in fiction. As a high schooler, this is one of my goals when I get to college. How long did it take you, and how did it benefit you in your writing career? Great question, Ron.
So it took me 3 years. I was teaching full-time still, and so I was taking night classes. And that's why it took me longer. Texas State has a 3-year program, but you can finish it in 2 if you're able to. And then I left and became a TA, and that led me to teaching at St. Edward's as well afterwards, before I started working at Austin Batcave. I think, you know, MFA programs, I have complicated feelings about it, and I'm not gonna sugarcoat that. I met a lot of really wonderful people in that program that are lifelong friends and who have influenced my work in a number of ways. I wouldn't be working with body writers if I hadn't attended that program. And so like, I think in many ways, if you can find and make connections and make your own community, then I think it can be really beneficial. But I was just talking about this with someone the other day, that I think the problem with MFAs, and I fell prey to this as well, is that not all MFAs are cut the same way, right? Like there's this illusion that you suddenly get all this writing time, and that's just not the case. Like you're also reading and studying, and often your program is funding you to teach as well. That's how they get your labor. You know what I mean? So like there's a, you know, there's kind of this path of academia that is often you know, it can help you meet other writers, it can help you make connections and find possibilities, and Austin Batcave was another part of that as well. But I think it can also be challenging if you're not a traditional student, and I wasn't at the time. I'd been out of college 6 years at that time. I'd been teaching, I was still working full time, I didn't live in San Marcos. So there's just things you have to consider. You know, who do you want to work with, right? What do you want to get out of that program? Those are very serious things to think about, because it's a lot of money, you know, that you would be spending potentially. So I could go off on that train a lot, but and I know it really is different for
I could
everybody.
too.
Yeah, I know you can. Right? Shark fighting control for the bathtub. What an amazing.
That feels like
Yeah,
the
what
second year of MFA program right there.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's a really great way to describe it. And the thing that I will also just kind of put out there is academia is still a very homogenous you know, space, no matter how much diversity and equity and inclusion work they've been trying to do in a particular world or academic space. And so I think a lot of them want to pretend as though that by getting into a cohort or an MFA, that community just happens. And that's just not how it works. Community is made, it is fostered, it is created every day. And it takes work to make it inclusive, and it takes work to make it respectful. And so if that's what you're looking for, you can find that other places. You can find that with, you know, places like Gemini Ink and other, you know what I mean? Like there are other community spaces that are doing that work. So yeah, I think some MFAs are great. People have very different experiences, but that's just my 2 cents.
No, it's a really interesting point. I think, if you don't mind me just saying 1 or 2 things, I think it also depends on when you go.
Yeah.
Like I was a youngin', I was 25 when I did my MFA, and I actually learned a ton from my fellow workshop participants who were older and much more mature as creators and individuals and writers than I was. And like my thesis at the end of that, I'm so glad I never published it. Like, because it wasn't ready to be my quote unquote first book. Did I make great friends? Did I learn a lot? Sure, you know, but I do think that's another thing to think about. Just to add to that your questions are fantastic, Leticia. Like, what do you want to get out of it? And those are hard questions to ask yourself before entering an MFA. But I think that also involves when you think it's best for you to go. So, and it's not always right after college. You know what I mean? I didn't go right after college, but, you know, I worked 2 or 3 years and then I went pretty soon after, you know, and sometimes there's something to be said for going a little later in your creative journey, but there's no one right answer for anybody. But I'll be quiet because your question was great. Does anyone else have questions for Leticia? We have about 6 precious minutes. I don't want to, if I missed you in the chat, I'm so sorry. But you can repost it or just tell me you want to ask a question and I'll unmute you happily. I'll ask one quick question if you don't mind, Leticia. Sure. So I guess, so what is, and you've asked amazing questions, Joe. I'm just kind of adding a little bit to that. So what does attract you to horror? The idea that you've already answered this a little bit, but why is it freeing?
Yeah, and specifically for me, one of the reasons why, I mean, there's like a ton of subgenres of horror. So there's like cosmic horror, there's supernatural horror, there's like possession, religious horror, you know, One of the reasons why I gravitate towards body horror as a subgenre that I like to watch and read and write in is that life is already horrifying, you know what I mean? And so sometimes I think writing horror and reading it, etc., is freeing, because I think it can be interesting to like explore different facets of fear, and where fear comes from. But I think that horror as a genre is also really interested in discussions. And Joe, you kind of touched on this a little bit of like, who has power in a situation? Who has power over other people? And I think as horror has gotten more inclusive, has gotten more diverse, as publishing in horror has gotten better, and filmmaking as well, we've seen a lot of shifting around whose stories get told and how folks are able to explore misogyny, sexual violence, the way that folks like that children are able to explore like vulnerabilities and things like that. And then of course, like racial violence, colonization, and those very serious issues that, also affect people's relationships to power. And so that's one of the reasons why I think I gravitate towards that. And with body horror, it, when I try to talk about some of my very real experiences with my body, sometimes it's like, this is absurd, right? It's often, an exploration in absurdity, and horror allows me to explore that absurdity and make that feel visceral and real, and it makes me feel seen, or at least that I'm acknowledging the experience in a way that maybe someone who doesn't experience it can get a glimpse into. Yeah.
I'm busily typing just one of your many.
Oh, yeah. No, you're good.
That's so interestingly said. No, thank you for just kind of diving into that a little bit more. That was really interesting to hear. Yeah, no, and my quote unquote stomach for tolerating horror has actually increased. I didn't have a very high tolerance before, but there's some fascinating storytelling happening through it.
Yeah.
And I do agree, it's kind of at a very explosive moment now. There's so much happening.
And for a long time, it was considered one of those subgenres, with less valued, because it was so attractive to the masses. And I don't think that that's the case anymore, or it should have never been, really.
And the same with romance, right? And like romance horror, that's a
Sci-fi,
thing.
yeah.
Sci-fi, yeah. These are things that like these crossing over and these meeting spaces, like we should be encouraging that, because just because something is popular doesn't mean that it's less valuable. People are connecting with stories in lots of different ways. Oh, John says horror allows us to dwell in our mind. I like that a lot. Yeah.
Interesting.
And fear is a really telling thing. What we fear, why we fear it. There's a really great book that I've been pulling from that I'm going to be teaching a little bit of in that body horror class. It's called, I'll put a link in the chat for those horror folks that want to learn more, but it's called Nightmare Fuel. It's about the science of horror, and like why we gravitate towards horror, especially in film. So definitely would recommend. I'm really enjoying it a lot.
I love that title, Nightmare Fuel.
Yeah, it's really great.
I'm going to check that out. Well, this has been a lovely author talk, Joe. Thank you so much for being our moderator.
Yes, thank you.
Fascinating questions. And just for purely selfish reasons, it's so great to see you from the Rio Grande Valley.
Thank you. It's good to see your face. I've missed you.
Yeah. And
Joe,
go on.
Oh, I was just going to shout out Joe and say, Joe, so yeah, when is the book coming out? And yeah, what are you working on?
Apparently I have a book that it's like one of those we talked about where it's difficult to get to the art of something. I have a book about my upbringing in poetry coming out in November through Next Page Press.
Yeah. Great.
That's
Next
awesome.
Page Press, I'm just going to shout it out because it's the San Antonio Poetry Press. Flower Song's a great South Texas press out of the Rio Grande Valley. A lot of great independent, exciting presses coming out of Texas and South Texas right now.
Absolutely.
And the amazing Laura Van Proyen, great poet, has launched Next Page Press, and she's already got several authors under her belt, and Joe's the next one. Woo woo!
So exciting.
Well, thank you so much, Leticia. It was so great to have you here.
Thank you, Alexandra.
I know we're having you work extra hard. You're teaching last night, talking tonight about your writing, but we loved it. And Joe, thank you for being a wonderful guest moderator. So everyone, thank you for joining us for the Big Texas Author Talk. And we did rebrand it from the Big Texas Read simply because you don't have to read the book before coming and joining these great author conversations. And we want to really have you just meet and hear authors talking about their worlds of writing. And of course, you can buy the book after if you want. We'd love you to do that. But it's truly an author conversation for anyone who wants to really get to know these great Texas writers a little bit more. So thank you for joining us. I'd love you to fill out that link I've put in once or twice. It's our survey. It's super short, but we just love to hear from our audience members. It helps us fine tune our programming. And we will be back next month in April. And we have Steve Adams, who's a novelist, and he's going to be talking about his novel, Remember This. So we'll see you soon. Thank you so much, Leticia, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, great talk. It was just great.
I really
Thanks,
appreciate
everyone.
it. Thank you.
We'll see you
Thank
soon.
you, Joe.
Bye, my friend. See you soon.
Bye.